Rabbi Saroken.
Hey, Rabbis Schwartz.
How are you? Welcome back from Eretz Yisrael.
Thank you. It feels like so long ago, but you're right.
Yep. Back to our podcast. Just want to acknowledge Jeremy
Mm.
behind the glass. Jeremy waved to everyone. Of course, you can't see him, but he's there. Believe he's there. He's absolutely there. How was your trip? It was great.
Yeah, trip was incredible.
Okay.
Incredible.
Okay, I know you spoke about it Shabbos morning, I think.
I
Folks can
did.
track that down.
Yeah.
Where would they find that, Jeremy?
YouTube
YouTube
and Facebook.
and Facebook.
Keyword
YouTube.
Bethel,
Baltimore. Not Bethel, Balto.
Baltimore.
Bethel, Baltimore. So you can look for it there. So this is Parsha discussion, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
So
getting into your favorite part of the Torah.
I knew you were going to do that.
It's-
No, it is not my favorite part of the Torah. In fact,
Why is
I
that?
know. You know what? I was saying this on Shabbat morning. Do you have a good weekend, by the way?
Yeah.
I was saying it on Shabbat morning that I always feel sad when Genesis ends. Like, I just feel like it's so juicy. Like, it's so interesting. I tell people oftentimes, like, if you've never read Genesis, it's like it's worthy of a read even on the beach. Like, it's everything that you want a story to be, and it's our story, which is really cool. And I feel like one of the things that I love about it is I know that we end up on top, right? Like, that's sort of how it goes. Like, it's an oscillating narrative. There's ups and there's downs, just as there is in any one of our lives and in our families' lives. But I know that it ends like on a high, right? Like, Joseph is there. He's got a good relationship with the Pharaoh. He's taking care of his entire family. You know, everyone's sort of gathered around. And then I feel like the curtain closes and we've it feels like it's like a yes moment, you know? And then we open up Shmot, the second book, and all of a sudden it feels like, I always say this, it's like Law and Order music is playing in the background. You know,
I don't watch a lot of TV, so that's TV, I think, right?
It is TV. It's sort of like that, like something bad is going to happen type of background music. Something bad always happens in Law and Order. That's a whole idea that
Well, I guess otherwise you wouldn't have a show.
Exactly. But so that for me is what happens in Exodus. All of a sudden we see a new Pharaoh arises. He doesn't remember Joseph. You know that's not good. It's foreboding. And then we see that the Jews are a threat to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians, and that there's sort of this idea that's put out there, which is to stop them from multiplying and stop them from being powerful and to stop them from, potentially threatening whatever it is that, they could threaten. I feel like it resonates deeply right now, right? This idea of I feel like in a whole bunch of different ways, but then all of a sudden we're into this story,
Right.
which is that Moses is, last week you guys spoke about that, but now in this parsha, Moses, again God is talking to him, and God is saying to him, like, I'm the God of your ancestors, of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And basically I've chosen you. Like, I'm going to be in the special relationship with you. You're going to know me more intimately than the others. And basically, I'm going to use you to redeem the Jewish people. But don't worry, God says again to Moshe, I'm going to be right there with you. I'm going to be beside you. I'm going to be sort of like maneuvering things because Moses is reluctant. Even though he started off reluctant last week, he's still reluctant this week. And God has to continuously sort of prop him up and encourage him and make sure that he knows that it's God that's really going to be making these miracles happen. It's not all on Moshe.
Yeah. I always feel bad for Moses because it's like the classic example of he's put into a position of doing something he doesn't really want to do, and then he gets in trouble for it, kind of, like in the court, like it's just all tsuris, a lot of it, really, and I'm sure sometimes he thinks to himself, I didn't want to do this in the first place. Like, I'm dealing with this, and I didn't want to do it in the first place. It's really, so it's tough. I do think, though, that there is this shift, to go back to your Genesis Exodus comments, that Exodus kind of makes the shift into telling the national story. I think
Yeah.
the Abraham cycle of stories and patriarchs and matriarchs, that's sort of this smaller scale, these families, sort of kind of hints of the origins of what will ultimately become a monotheistic Jewish tradition. But it's so sort of far back in antiquity. And the events of Exodus, resonate in some way, like with a historic sense and a connection to the things that in our own minds we say, okay, like I can relate to that more so. In other words, to Abraham, Sarah, okay, like maybe
Huh.
there were first Jews, I guess. Maybe they were Abraham and Sarah, whatever. But there were people. But I do have a sense that I had ancestors who were slaves, and that to me is very powerful kind of thing.
That's so. There's so many things that are interesting to me right now, but the first is that's actually really interesting to me that you identify more with your ancestors that were enslaved in Egypt. Like for me, I actually identify more with like those initial families that I feel like, oh yeah, that happened to my family too, right?
Right.
Or like I feel like the Jews that were enslaved in Egypt, I sort of feel like it's just so general. Like I don't feel like through the Torah we know much about them except that they like cry out to God. Right? Like at least
Sort
the
of
people.
communally,
Yeah. Like later on, I think when we get to the wilderness, I sort of feel that sense of like, yes, I know what it means to feel stuck, or I know what it means to not know where I'm going or not know when I'm going to get there, and to feel afraid of like making a big leap, right? Like I understand what it means to be like, let's just go back. Right. Or
Right.
like I can do the wilderness, I could do Genesis, but I think that that's where this like Exodus stuff sort of makes me feel not lost, but I'm like a watcher as opposed to an experiencer.
Well, it's not about individuals, it's
Yeah.
really not. I mean, Moses obviously is individually a prime character, a very important character. Aaron, Miriam, also, but it's really about this national journey.
Yeah.
It's a journey of the nation as a whole, and so as an individual, it's hard to access that. And it's not about like, 100% Genesis with sort of the difficulties of family relationships and the personal quest and all that kind of stuff. No, that's not. Exodus is, by and large, it's about the national attempt to enter into this covenantal relationship with God as a nation, not as individuals.
It's so interesting what you're saying on a lot of different levels, but I feel like one of the things that as Jews we do is we learn that the I is actually not nearly as important as the we.
Right.
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 That's sort of the minion concept. That's the idea of that it is the collective more than the individual that our tradition teaches us to think about and care about most.
Something that's by and large lost in contemporary
Yeah.
culture, by the way.
Yeah. Right. Which I do think is countercultural. But I also think that it's interesting because you have to sort of weave yourself, in order to have empathy and to really sort of like connect with this, you have to weave yourself into a story, as you said, that almost doesn't have any names. I mean, it has names attached, but you don't really have that feeling of like, of the qualities or character. Like you can't.
Right. You don't have the fly on the wall.
Yeah.
The fly on the wall is Genesis. You're like, ooh,
for sure.
Ooh, wow. Gee.
Okay. I want to go back with you though. I think it's fascinating what you said about Moses, right? Like you sort of feel sorry for him because here's this guy and like he didn't really want to. And it's so interesting. I feel like we could probably like analyze this for like a long while. I feel like Moses is so lucky.
Lucky?
Yeah, like it's a bit of like it's a hard.
We're redefining lucky here.
Not like no. It's like he just has this like incredible. I know he has this like incredible journey with that's hard sometimes and deeply meaningful. I feel like he is chosen, and sort of like taught by God along the way. But I feel like ultimately, can you imagine at the end of your life, right? Like Moses, sort of having the opportunity to look back and to say, like, look at all that like I was able to accomplish, and look what I was able to do with our people. And I don't know, I just feel like it probably wasn't all, you know, roses or whatever it is, but I feel like it was like a deeply meaningful journey.
For Moses.
Yeah.
I really don't read it that way. I mean, I think that Moses had a lot at Surus, and people were always hassling him about one thing or another. It's this to that to that. There's almost no nachas the whole way through. He's always walking on a tightrope. He's like has to defend God's ready to destroy the people all these different times, and Moses has to defend them when they've given him a hard time. It's sort of similar in that same sense of having to do something that he doesn't really want to do. I just think it's very hard. And then in the end, he's told, you're not even going to get to go into Eretz Yisrael, like go up to the top of the mountain.
But he got them to like the edge. Like he got them to the river's edge. He found out that they were actually going to, not with him, but they would go without him under Joshua's leadership at that point, but that they were going to make it into the promised land.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, that's just such an accomplishment, such an achievement. And I think in some ways, like he had a great relationship with his brother, Aaron. He was in relationship with his sister. The children he probably didn't get to see as much as he wished he had, know.
Right.
But I also think that in some ways we see, and this is true of our lives, right? Like you and I are, like we're always doing eulogies for people and like sort of reliving people's stories. We see the sort of big moments, but I wonder if in the in-between moments, there weren't some really, I don't know. I like to think that he had some good times.
I hope so. Maybe.
I don't know.
Some Iraq along the way.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
It's alcohol.
But what about Va'era? What's
Yeah. So I really meant it before, when I jokingly, as was not a joke, said to you that these are not my favorite Torah portions. We had a teacher in rabbinical school who would say, like, you can't say that about any Torah portion, but I think it is true for me because there's just a lot of magic going on, right? We get into the plagues, and we see that in this Torah portion, we have 4 plagues, and the first 3 of them, neither Pharaoh nor the Egyptians were convinced, right? They had magicians on their side that could keep up with God's miracles. And so, it didn't really move the needle in terms of the bigger goal, which is at this point that Moses is really instructed by God to go confront Pharaoh and to convince him to let the people go. But what we really know is that this really wasn't about convincing Pharaoh. It was about convincing, all of the people, including the Jewish people, that God was basically pulling the strings, right? That God was powerful, that God could be trusted, that God could be relied upon, so that they would have the courage to do hard things.
Yeah, and they're very like Moses. I mean, it's kind of interesting. I really thought about it this way, but sort of along the lines of Moses himself, the people are very resistant to that, at least initially. Yeah, I mean, it's understandable. You've been a slave for X number of hundreds of years, and someone comes to you and says, "Oh, I got great news. Great news. Remember God? That God that hasn't paid attention to you in 75 years. Oh, now that God is gonna pay attention and do all this stuff, and you got to be like, okay, that's a little weird, but so I think it's a struggle for the people, Moses even addressed it. Moses says, "What am I gonna? They're not gonna believe me."
Right.
He doesn't say it exactly like that, but that's what he means. And they're not gonna believe me. What? And that's why you have the signs.
Yeah.
That's why you have the rod that turns into the snake. That's why you have the hand that that becomes sort of leprous, has leprosy, and or whatever it is. Yeah. So.
It's an interesting thing, right? So it almost feels like, to your point, Moses really has 2 challenges. One is his own self-doubt as being chosen as to be the leader. It's not even like, I mean, Aaron's going to help him, but by and large, it's really just the two of them at this point.
Right.
So one is that, I guess he has three challenges. One is he going to be able to successfully convince Pharaoh to let the people go? Then he's got the other part, which is he going to be able to convince the people, right, to go?
Right.
And then I think, I would probably say that those are the two main challenges.
And the other thing that's going on here, I think, through the early parts, through this whole sort of tension between Pharaoh and Moses and the people, are they going to get out, they're not going to get out, and all this stuff. In some ways, it's really a contest between Pharaoh and God. Pharaoh seen as a God-like figure in ancient Egypt, God being God, and that's sort of like, and Moses, in a way, is almost sort of like just the kind of the intermediary there. Jeremy, would you do me a big favor and just throw me a bottle of water? You could do that.
But it's an interesting thing because there are a couple of verses, I think, that are particularly interesting to me. The first is chapter 6, verse 9. He said, catch it.
Oh, high toss.
He said, but when Moses told this to the Israelites, meaning that God was gonna free him. But when Moses told this to the Israelites, they would not listen to Moses. And then listen to this like amazing thing. It says, because their spirits were crushed by cruel bondage. And I think that that's actually like an interesting thing, right? When your spirits are crushed, what are you capable or able to do?
Yeah.
And then the other part I think that was really interesting also is, first to just recognize that Moses is 80 years old at this point, and Aaron, his big brother, is 83 when they're sort of going into this conversation. But
God bless him.
It's older. And then the other thing that I thought was interesting, was that sorry, it's in a different section.
Yeah, that's all right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think so. So there are these sort of like interesting psychological subtexts to the text. Even though it's really not like we were saying in terms of Genesis with the individual stories and all that kind of stuff, the family dynamics. But one of the psychological subtexts is, and it continues to play out really through the rest of the Torah. What is the kind of communal psychological effect of enslavement? What does that mean? I was talking to someone the other day, and they were saying that they had been in a conversation with a friend about the black community, and the friend was saying, why is it that the black community would still talk about slavery? That happened like 200 years ago, not even 200 years ago. And the friend replied to the person, I'm Jewish. We still talk about slavery.
Right.
Like,
it's important.
The effects of slavery, the psychological effects, the ramifications of it really are long-lasting and maybe forever lasting. I mean, here we are thousands of years later, and we still look back and think about what that meant and how grateful we should be to have our freedom and all of those kinds of things. So kotzer ruach, crushed spirit, is like a reflection of what does it mean being enslaved people? What is the psychological effect of that? And then throughout the rest of the Torah, like they can't seem to release that. They can't get out of it. And so that's one of the reasons. Maybe that's why that generation doesn't go into the promised land, and it's the next one that goes in.
Right. Which we oftentimes will say, right, that like the Dor B'Midbar, that the generation of the wilderness isn't the one that can sort of go and create anew. When you were saying, though, it was making me think about some of the other historical moments that we do hold on to as a source of terrible tragedy and also a testimony to the resilience of our people and like sort of what human beings have the capacity to overcome. I for sure, of course, am thinking of, the Shoah as one of those times. But I'm also thinking today as like we're talking about, these plagues and what it means to be enslaved. Like, what's happening right now in in our world, right? With our, was 98, now is 95 people that are being held in captivity still, in Gaza. Just the impact of, look, we don't yet know what's happening to them there. Please God, I imagine we will come to learn, and hopefully it will not be the worst case scenarios, although being held in captivity for 472 days feels like something that human beings should never have to go through or endure. But, we talk about enslavement, and I feel like what's happening now, both between having, captives that were being, I would say, like that Hamas is extorting us to bring back, or to release.
Yeah.
But then also this idea of like this anti-Semitic, air that we seem to be breathing in lately. I feel like I don't know that it's crushed our spirits, but I definitely think it's taken a toll on the Jewish spirit.
Yeah,
like on the,
I think so. It's been
And
a
then-
challenge, going through a challenging time.
And how does that impact, right? Like we're thinking about the impact of that, right? Like it was so bad for our ancestors to be enslaved, and still they were reluctant to leave
Right.
Egypt,
Right.
right? Like what does it do to be beaten down? And then like what's the psychological and communal toll on our community today?
Those are great questions. And then even in their wandering, they go back to this. Would have been better if we'd stayed.
Right.
That sort of psychological captivity construct there. Yeah. Thank goodness, things hopefully are moving in a more positive direction in Israel, and more hostages hopefully will be released, and all that kind of.
Amen.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
It seems to me right now moving positive.
Any takeaway from the first set of plagues? We're going to have a couple more sets to go.
I mean, we're getting the sign from Jeremy that we got to wrap it up. So we must be at 45 minutes at this point. But what always comes up is the whole hardening of the heart business. People ask about that. They wonder about that. Why does Pharaoh, what's that all? Why does God harden Pharaoh's heart, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah.
And that's another, to me, psychological drama that's playing out in the text, in the sense that the way I've always understood it is, initially it says that Pharaoh is sort of hardening his own heart, and then later it says that God is hardening Pharaoh's heart. Right. So I've always understood that as the person, we all know these people, they kind of get into a pattern of bad behavior. And they do one wrong thing, then another, then another, then another. And at a certain point in that chain of action, you are stuck into a place where you no longer have a choice. And that's how I see the Pharaoh and the hardening of the heart business. It's sort of psychologically, he gets himself into this place. And once he's there, he has no choice. And that's where the Torah starts to use the language, God is hardening the heart, because there's nowhere else to go.
It's interesting because you see that for sure at play, and then you also see at play, sort of these leaders, right? Pharaoh, in particular, Pharaoh as a leader making decisions that are deeply impacting in very problematic ways the lives of his people.
Yeah, for sure.
And you definitely feel, it's Pharaoh's stubbornness and his own, concerns that ultimately the people have to pay a price for.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that's also interesting that you watch the people suffering, and you sort of want to be like, you can make the stop. Right? Like all you have to do is say like, okay.
Right.
And then this stops. And I think in some ways too, that for me feels really like deeply resonant of this moment in time, right? Like, I mean, I hate to go political, but I will for just a moment to say that in some ways I feel like, whether it was Yahya Sinwar or whomever it is that was like in charge in Gaza, like I feel like if you released those that are being held in captivity, things would have or could have been different, a long time back.
Well, yeah, sure, likely. We'll see what happens over the next few weeks.
So much to unpack.
So, okay,
Next
folks.
week.
Yeah. Thank you for the time as always, Jeremy. Appreciate you minding the ship, steering the ship, whatever the right language is, navigating, and we'll see you all next week.